Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Boscombe Valley was mysterious, Shoscombe Place was old, and the lodge was hysterical, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Was Holmes more of a tea drinker or a coffee fancier? And what are all of the alcoholic drinks mentioned in the stories?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 306, Doyle and Water. Well, hello there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, are you keeping your head above water these days?
I am keeping my head above water. You know, the wonderful thing is, since we installed the old sump pump, the water on the second floor of my house rarely gets up to my belt.
Oh, well, that's good. That's good. Do you have slippers or swimming shoes?
I both, depending on, of course, the time of the year. You know, I always aspired when I was younger to own beachfront property, and thanks to climate change, here in northern New Jersey, I soon will have it.
Well, congratulations. You are now a tide waiter.
No, wait a minute. What's the difference between a tide waiter and a coal? No.
No, the difference between a tide waiter and a hip waiter. Is that?
No, and a dumb waiter. Wait a minute. A dumb waiter is a guy who brings you the wrong order.
Yeah, well, this is basically Sherlock Holmes for Dummies, what we're doing here. Our little show. So we like to explore some of the things in the Sherlock Holmes stories, maybe things you've happened upon or come across, maybe you've scratched your head about, maybe you haven't looked across a number of stories and pieced things together. Well, that's what we're here for, and that's what we're going to do today, talking about water. If you'd like the show notes for this episode, they are available at ihose.co/trifles306, all lowercase. If you plug that into your browser, ihose.co/trifles306, or just go to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com and look for the Doyle and Water episode. We do appreciate your support. Our patrons every month are all eligible to play in our drawing, where we every month draw for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal, and every quarter we do a drawing for a free annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal, which includes the Christmas annual, something that will actually come into play in this episode. So make sure that you are supporting us. It can be as little as $1 a month, but you get to pick the amount. We do have some thank you gifts for our Patreon supporters. Just check it out in the show notes or at patreon.com/trifles. Well, I know this is not one of our scholarship episodes. The first of the month, we do something that we call Mr. Sherlock Holmes, a Theorist, where we take a piece of scholarship and pick it apart. And then the third week of the month, we do a master's class in some exemplary form of Sherlockian investigation. But the inspiration here, Burt, is of your making. So I'm going to let you tee it up for us.
Well, you know, Scott, as we go through life, we have to make our own inspiration. But, reading, I mean, all of us, our listeners, you, me, have in common a real love of reading. And that's the great thing about the hobby of Sherlock Holmes. There's so many interesting and new things to read. And I happened to pick up my copy of the Baker Street Journal 1999 Christmas Annual. Again, another great reason to subscribe to the Baker Street Journal, because you get this series of wonderful annuals at the end of the year. And I was reading there a terrific paper written by our old friend, our old late friend. And I know to our listeners, that can be maybe a constant theme here. We're always going back to people who've passed on. But, but there are many wonderful people who are writing new things, of course, that we also talk about here in Trifles. But our old friend Bob Tomlin, who wrote a really interesting paper because he was smart enough and creative enough to ask the question, hey, when it comes to the cases of Sherlock Holmes, what about water?
Yeah, what about water?
Yeah, what about it? And son of a gun, he wrote a paper called Doyle and Water Do Mix. And he says, well, water covers approximately 75% of the Earth's surface. It accounts for a big part of the human body. It was deified, he said, by ancient or even some contemporary civilizations. None of us can live without it. Yet, for all of its life-giving properties, it's astonishing how frequently water is used as an instrument of death in the canon. And he goes on, and his work and his thinking about this, he came up with 13 cases in which bodies of water play destructive roles.
I'm just going to pause here for a quick drink. Okay. I'm struck by Bob's observance about no one being able to live without water. I mean, that's such a obviously universal fact. I came across a quote by W.H. Auden from 1957, who wrote, "Thousands have lived without love, not one without water." And yet you think of the destructive power of water, whether it's via drowning or floods that wipe out entire communities and coastlines. We've seen a lot of that in weather incidents in recent years. It is catastrophic, and it is probably the single force of nature. Well, there are a number of forces of nature that are incontrovertible or uncontestable by man. Try your hand against lava at some point. But water is the universal solvent. Given enough time, it will wear down a stone. It can provide life, yet it can provide death at the same time. So interesting that we have a number of instances in the Sherlock Holmes stories where it is, in fact, associated with death.
Yes, and the incident that everybody thinks about first, usually, is the Reichenbach Falls. And the whole point there, of course, is that for the longest while, of course, we now know in The Final Problem and The Empty House that actually Holmes' disappearance was really a matter of miscommunication between he and Watson. But Watson thought that for a long while his friend Sherlock Holmes had gone down that precipice, and he says, I was staring down into that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam. And any attempt to recover the bodies of Holmes and Moriarty, would be absolutely hopeless. But we learn, of course, in The Empty House, that it was only Moriarty who was swallowed up by that dreadful chasm.
That makes me think, obviously a dangerous waterfall like that, our modern technology, scuba diving gear, etc., that would not make that any easier simply because of the force of the falls. But I have to wonder, both in modern times as well as in Holmes and Watson's time, there must have been occasions when the Reichenbach Falls slowed, probably in the winter, I would imagine, when things froze up. Holmes was there in early May, so you had the spring thaw going on. But would there have been an instance when someone could have gone down to the bottom of that chasm and search for the bodies.
Well, we get these reports all the time now that we have global warming of people uncovering, remarkable things that have been lost over the centuries as ice retreats and so on. They just found, I think, cameras I was reading that had been lost since 1935 from some Arctic expedition and so on. But I hope somebody is down there, on a regular basis near Reichenbach. Maybe the Reichenbacher regulars are doing this, wondering if global warming is going to make it possible to actually retrieve Moriarty's body.
There you go. I just listened to a podcast the other day about the mystery of Skeleton Lake. You ever heard of Skeleton Lake?
Yeah, I think I have.
Yeah, Rupkund Lake in India. It's about 15,000 feet up, or 5,000 meters. And there's some hundreds of skeletons in this shallow lake, and no one seems to know why they're there. Carbon dating places them back about 500 to 800 years, but no one seems to know exactly what the mystery of Skeleton Lake consists of, whether it was religious pilgrims or people from a trade route or sacrifice or what. So anyway,
well, those of course were the days before they invented lifeguards. So I suspect that it was probably just
someone forgot to put up the no swimming signs.
Well, yeah, I think it was probably just a seaside resort for a very confused race of our early ancestors. They were probably having lots of conversation like, where's Leonard? And somebody would say, well, weren't you watching him?
Leonard.
I thought you were watching him.
That reminds me of George and Benny, the two cats from Warner Brothers that were modeled on George and Lenny from Of Mice and Men. and the big one, Benny, threw George across the pier and into the side of a ship. He slid down and fell in the water. And the sign there said no swimming. And Benny said, George, can't you read that sign? It says no fishing. Anyway, back to water.
Good grief. Well, look, we're on a path here quickly, escaping from popular culture to get back to these 13 cases. So we have the final problem, obviously. The next one, of course, the Gloria Scott. This is the height of the Crimean War, 1855. We find out that the real root of what's going on in this strange story is that the 500-ton bark Gloria Scott was being used to deliver prisoners to Australia, and the regular convict ships were being used as transports for the military. So, there were plenty of seagoing vessels that were playing roles for which they were never intended, and that's how Trevor Sr. found himself, in the hold of the bark, plotting a mutiny with the evil Jack Prendergast.
Yeah.
And so they took over the Gloria Scott, and look what happened.
Yeah, well, they escaped to a lifeboat, and the mutineers were left behind and blew the boat to smithereens. It was rent by a terrific explosion. So, so that, an early instance in Holmes's career where water does not end well for. It wasn't the main character, but it certainly played a role in that main character's eventual demise.
Yes. And now the lovely thing, too, is that there are a number of these instances in the world of Sherlock Holmes where water makes an appearance, but you wouldn't think about it if somebody told you. So, for example, somebody had said to me, well, what about water in the Veiled Lodger? I would have said, well, what about it? This is a case where Eugenia Ronder and her would-be lover, Leonardo the strongman, figure out that what they really want to do is do away with Eugenia Ronder's husband. And so the plot is Leonardo is going to bludgeon this guy to death with a club that looks like the paw of a lion. And, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in the end, poor Mrs. Ronder, has this disfigured face and withdraws from society. But what happens to Leonardo? Well, while all of this discussion is happening with Sherlock Holmes, Holmes asks about Leonardo. Is he dead? And Eugenia Ronder says, he was drowned last month while bathing near Margate. I saw his death in the paper.
Well, you can't help but wonder if that was his own fault. I mean, he should have been showering. Yeah, a drowning accident, evidently. No evidence as to what caused it, but, there's this thing where, and we'll see this continually throughout the stories, where when Doyle does invoke a water-related death, it is usually associated with some sort of karma. That and we see this in many 1950s television programs. I'm thinking about Alfred Hitchcock Presents or The Twilight Zone, where evil rarely escapes punishment, and I think this is divine retribution in the way of water, thanks to Doyle.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Well, let's take a quick break here and give you folks a water break or perhaps a bathroom break, who knows, and we'll hear from our sponsor.
The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to BakerStreetIrregulars.com today.
We mentioned Bob Tomlin before, whose paper we're referring to here. We did an interview with Bob over on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. We'll have a link to that episode in the show notes. I think we revisited that when he died just in the last year or two. So we mentioned just a handful of stories so far, but let's breeze through the rest of these because there are quite a few to get through. Bert, when it comes to the resident patient, again, I would not have thought of water relating to a death in the resident patient. Where do we find that?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a great point. And the resident patient is about this criminal who's hiding out and who's eventually done in by other gang members. But when you get to the end of it, one of the things you find out that the 3 gang members who did this fellow in have disappeared. Nothing has been seen of them. And it was surmised, we find out, by Scotland Yard, that they were among the passengers of the ill-fated steamer Nora Creina, which was lost some years ago with all hands upon the Portuguese coast, some leagues to the north of Oporto.
Oh, maybe they were just in search of some good port.
In any port in a story.
Any port.
No, and then there's the 5 orange pips. No, you wouldn't think that, anything, well, of course, I guess you would, if you thought through the entire story and what happens at the end. But of course, Holmes understands who the miscreants are, and he sends a wire over to America. And we know that the police of Savannah, Georgia are waiting for their ship to arrive and to arrest them. But that never happens. Watson says, we did at last hear that somewhere far out in the Atlantic, a shattered stern post of the boat was seen swinging in the trough of a wave with the letters LS carved on it. And that's all we will ever know of the fate of the Lone Star.
Yeah. And well, let's not forget that earlier in that story, both of the Openshaws died a water-related death. Uncle Elias was found face downward in a little green-scummed pool, which lay at the foot of the garden. It was only 2 feet deep, but that's sufficient enough for drowning. And then John Openshaw, Holmes's client, met his fate by the Waterloo Bridge on the way home, and his body was found in the Thames.
Yeah, right.
So triple water murders or deaths in the 5 Orange Pips.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I wonder if anyone has explored in the canon whether or not there were criminals or groups of criminals, because this group would qualify as one whose preferred instrument of death for some reason was always drowning. Well, that's interesting.
The Dribble Glass Gang. they were always one step ahead of you, and their counterpart, the Squirty Flower Gang.
Oh, you're clearly having a good day today.
Well, you know who didn't have a good day was Tonga when he ended up also in the Thames, shot by either Holmes or Watson. I think Holmes did, as he tried to take aim at them with his blow dart. He ended up falling off the steamship there in the Sign of Four and floating away down the Thames.
Yeah, well, and not only that, but in Sign of Four, of course, Jonathan Small loses a leg while he was swimming in the Ganges. So that's another appearance.
Another bathing accident.
Another bathing accident. And then, of course, there's the adventure of Black Peter, which is all based upon figuring out the fact that some years ago a crime was involved at sea when somebody was pitched overboard during the middle watch of a dark night.
Yeah, it was the father of the accused, John Hopley Nelligan. His father had been heading for, I think, Norway or something like that. So, Thor Bridge too. Bridge over troubled water, indeed. That's where Maria Pinto, or Maria. Goodness, why am I forgetting the last name of the Gold King? Gibson. Maria Gibson. Died by suicide, gunshot to the head, the pistol being pulled off and into the water. So that was associated. In that case, water was used to hide the weapon of choice. So it was death by association with water, but not a water-caused death.
Well, that's true, but also Watson is forever mentioning these unexplored cases. And it's in Thor Bridge that when Watson is talking about some of the unfinished cases in the tin dispatch box, he says, no less remarkable is that of the cutter Alicia, which sailed one spring morning into a small patch of mist from which she never again emerged. And nor was anything ever heard of herself and her crew. And the same sort of comment happens in the Norwood Builder when Watson says, on looking over my notes, this period includes the shocking affair of the Dutch steamship Friesland, which so nearly cost us both our lives, and which aggravatingly we will never find out more about.
Yeah. And as we wrap up the Valley of Fear, Holmes discovers that John Douglas has met his fate in the water as well. His ship reached Cape Town, and Inspector Barker received a telegram from Mrs. Douglas that Jack has been lost overboard in a gale off St. Helena. No one knows how the accident occurred. So like the vicious KKK and the gang from the resident patient, they found their revenge. The Scourers found their revenge eventually.
Yes, and then, just sort of coming to the end here, we've got obviously the Lion's Mane, where there is the death, a mysterious death right there at the seaside. And also, interestingly enough, Bob recalled a comment that Holmes made at one point. He's talking to Jabez Wilson from
Red-Headed League?
from the Red-Headed League. And Holmes says, Watson, I begin to think I make a mistake in explaining Abne ignotum pro magnifico, and my poor little reputation, such as it is, will suffer shipwreck if I am so candid.
That's a nice spot there. That's interesting. Well, when you consider that Watson enjoyed Clark Russell's fine sea stories, as he admits to us in, I'm not sure what tale he admitted that to us in. Was it The Cardboard Box, maybe? Or was that one of his yellowback novels? Either way, he admits to reading some fine sea stories. And we know that Doyle himself spent time aboard an Arctic whaler. He only spent some time aboard the whaler. He was actually congratulated for his swimming abilities for the number of times he fell overboard into the icy ocean. So we do have this appreciation of the sea from Doyle via Watson and certainly via Holmes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a great review, and it just points out that if you think about just about anything in the world of Sherlock Holmes, his 40-year career, these 60 stories, just picking out one thing, as fundamental as water, just gives you a whole new lens on looking at the adventures and thinking about how the different characteristics of them and the different factors feature in the lives of these folks.
And we didn't even begin to touch upon the Bruce Partington submarine.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Well, isn't that interesting? Are the Bruce Partington plans, is that a case where water never appears?
That's a good point. Other than obviously the submarine described in the plans, I don't think there is anything to do with water
or the naval treaty.
Yeah. Well, it's raining in that one.
Well, it is raining, but I say, Percy, are you thirsty? Oh, no, thank you.
Well, drip, drip, drip. And I guess that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. These are very deep waters.